Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 4, Episode 34. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. Do you want to choose your next significant other, your partner, the person that you're going to have a relationship with, by way of using a dating app? Most people would say, hell no. Well, that's the way we're choosing our presidential candidates today. And instead of no more than a bad date story, we're stuck with these people for 4 years. And note, dear listener, the messaging is changing. The messaging from the left is changing. Gone is the doom and gloom of Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy. In comes Donald Trump is weird. J.D. Vance is weird. For an orange man that says wacky shit, this is not a good turn of events. Thank you all for listening. If you are new to the podcast, if you're new to the channel, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review. Please send to friends and enemies far and wide. If you like what you hear, you can consider supporting at Patreon. This Is Why I Don't Vote is on Patreon. Without further ado.
Act 1, a dating app approach to choosing the President of the United States.
It's been officially a month since Joe Biden announced he would not run for re-election as President of the United States, and roughly over 3 weeks since Kamala Harris became the de facto candidate. I say it that way because it didn't become official until this week, and this podcast coming out on a Saturday. I'm trying not to use but too many dates. But the point I want to make is it's been close to a month, and Kamala Harris hasn't done a one-on-one sit-down interview with any member of the media. This is a concerning phenomenon in my mind, and although it's unique to the last two Democratic nominees, Joe Biden and now Kamala Harris, my concern is that it's going to become a more globally accepted practice that someone running for president of the United States can dodge, and that's probably the best word, or at least navigate strategically the number of sit-down interviews they have with members of the media, as well as the number of debates that the candidates actually engage in. For all intents and purposes, our presidential nominating process and our election process is going to look like an Instagram or a Twitter or a TikTok account. It's going to be pure bullshit. There's not going to be any insertion of reality into that process such that we're going to be able to see any of these people who are running for president of the United States, mind you, under pressure in any way. Speaking specifically about Kamala Harris, the biggest problem with Kamala Harris and the reason why she did not get any further in 2020 in her own presidential run is because when you sat her down across from another human being who could challenge her on anything, she completely fell apart. It's one of the reasons why, even though she was a sitting vice president of the United States, over the course of the first 12 to 18 months of the Biden administration, they realized we can't have her face forward with any member of the media without being supervised. All she can do is stand in front of a camera with a podium and a microphone before her and read from a teleprompter. Kamala Harris actually does that well. She does it very well. But if you put her into an environment where she has to speak extemporaneously, where she has to speak off of the fly or off of the cuff, to use a euphemism or two, she doesn't adapt. It's like the synapses in her brain don't fire. When she doesn't have something memorized or she's not reading off of a teleprompter, she completely falls apart and looks like a buffoon. In 2020, as we were going through this presidential process and Joe Biden ended up being the nominee, what struck a lot of people, and I was one of them, was the lack of interviews that he was doing. And it struck me because, although it's unique, it wasn't a politically stupid strategy. It was clear, given a lot of the things that were going on in 2020, that the Biden team wanted to expose Donald Trump and let him talk his way out of the presidency. It appears that Kamala Harris's team is doing the exact same thing. So what should be the arbiter of whether or not these candidates are allowed to engage in such political stratagem, in what I think we would all agree is pretty nefarious strategery? It should be that entity that claims it's the watchdog of the American political system, but as we are routinely reminded, is certainly not. That's the media. There should be cries coming from the media as to whether or not there's going to be a sit-down interview with a journalist, or 2, or 10, or 20, and when that's going to be. Not only are you not getting this kind of pushback from the legacy, the mainstream media, it's almost as if they're complicit in this strange void, this lack of any one-on-one interview with this woman at all. All you see of Kamala Harris is speeches where she's reading from a script, or it's these appearances which are themselves crafted, scripted, choreographed. I just learned this week, and it prompted me to want to do this piece because it was on my mind, but Kamala Harris was on the cover of Time magazine, and that is usually an indication that there is a one-on-one, a sit-down interview with the person, and the feature inside Time magazine on Kamala Harris, who was on the cover, ostensibly because she was running for president of the United States, it did not have a personal interview with her at all. It had no attributable quotes to Kamala Harris after Joe Biden dropped out of the race. There was no interview associated with this piece, which means, for all intents and purposes, it was a fluff piece. The media isn't pushing back on this. At least they haven't thus far. And you have J.D. Vance. I've seen him in a couple of interviews, and I've seen Trump as well in a couple of his interviews. Why hasn't Kamala Harris sat down with any member of the media to do a one-on-one interview? Again, I don't want this to be a pure, unadulterated focus on one candidate in one political election. It is strange, though, that over the course of the last 2 elections, both Democratic nominees have refrained from doing one-on-one sit-down interviews with members of the media because they didn't feel like they had to, and the media didn't push back on them to challenge such a political strategy. We should not have people running for president of the United States of this country if they can't sit down with a member of the media and articulate their positions and defend their positions. If they can't be challenged on the things that they've said or done in the past, and they can't be challenged on what they would do with current or present situations or potential situations, probable or sometimes improbable future situations. If that's the case, if the media isn't going to push back on these candidates in order to have these one-on-one sit-down interviews, we really are, more than we ever have, relying on what we see in these rallies, political rallies, or in these really staged, controlled public appearances. That's social media. That's basically having a filter and some sort of button to edit any photo or video that you're able to put out on social media to make your life look like the make-believe life that you've always wanted. That works on social media. People go on to social media to not only participate in that fantasy in their own lives, but to experience the fantasy of other people's lives. We've talked about that numerous times on this podcast. Everything on social media is bullshit. It is the thief of joy because you're constantly comparing yourself to this false narrative, this false reality that most people are putting up there. But what if that's the person who's running for president of the United States, the most powerful position on earth, and everything that they've put forth is a fantasy? It's a representation put through a filter that is so sophisticated. I mean, one of the things, I'm not going to go on a tangent, but I kind of am. You look at some of the photographs on social media and the filters these days, you can literally misrepresent who you are and what you look like through these filters. And it's not some highly sophisticated technology that you have to press a bunch of buttons and you have to scroll through things. You just press one icon and it completely alters the appearance of anyone in a photograph, if not completely deletes them. Is that the way We want to elect a president of the United States based on the most obscene misrepresentation of who they are and what they look like. This is not gender specific. Go on an online dating app and then go out and meet some of the people and look at them in person versus looking at them in their photographs. It's laughable. It's absolutely laughable. Whether it's Republicans or Democrats, whether it's conservatives or liberals, we need the media to push back on any candidate that thinks that they can avoid doing a sit-down interview with a member of the media in order to articulate what they believe in and defend it. And as much as I'm sure people want me to talk about this particular election, I really don't care. I'm more concerned about the precedent it sets that you have two different candidates from the same party over the course of a 4-year span feeling empowered to simply avoid doing a sit-down interview with members of the media to articulate what they believe in and how they would defend it. And let's not for a second think that it's going to be the lesser of two evils or somehow, based on what you're seeing represented in this false narrative, is going to turn out great in the long run. No one goes into a date on a social media app and thinks this person's going to look infinitely better in person than they do in these photographs that some of them now you can tell have been altered. Do any of us want to have the same approach for how we interact with the President of the United States as we do the approach that we have going on a first date, having met someone on a dating app? We'd go on a hell of a lot fewer dates if that was the case, because no one wants to take that kind of risk being tied to someone for 4 years based on the representations they make on Bumble or Hinge or Tinder. I certainly don't want a dating app approach to choosing the President of the United States.
Act 2. The message is changing.
We've all had jobs where we've gotten into situations in our corporate environment. We've gotten into a silo. We realize that the team that we work on, or even the department we work in, or even the office that we work at, is one of many in this major conglomerate that is this corporation, and we get in these silos. And that silo acts as an echo chamber. So you can have on your team or in your department or in your office all of these beliefs, these policies based on those beliefs, corporate decision making based on the policies, which are based on the beliefs, and then it spills over into the data. We are going to gather the data that supports our policies, which are founded on our beliefs, and it's just going to reinforce this echo chamber that's part of this silo that we didn't even see that we created. That's Joe Biden and the Democratic Party over the course of the last 12 months. And the message that was effective within the four walls of that echo chamber was about how Donald Trump was an existential crisis. Donald Trump posed an existential threat to the very fabric of democracy. As we've gone over in many pieces on this podcast, but particularly the last segment, the media rarely pushes back on these narratives, will adopt them at a moment's notice if they feel like that it can gain them any kind of favor with any political administration. Sorry to say, it does not have to be a liberal. It does not have to be a Democratic administration. I've gone over in other segments how there have been plenty Republican or conservative administrations, whether it be at the White House, whether it be at state government, and the media will fall in line. The media fell in line on the Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy. Did the Biden White House act in accord with this messaging? No, it didn't. Did the Democratic Party act in accord with this messaging? No, it didn't. We've actually talked about on this podcast how Democratic fundraisers, political action committees, how all sorts of Democratic apparatchiks, they came out to support the kookiest, the wackiest Republican candidates in order to put an existential threat to democracy on the ballot, such that the choice was threat to democracy or Democratic candidate. More often than not, this gamble paid off. Here in the state of Arizona, I believe we did a segment on the fact that the Secretary of State, who, as many of you know, ends up certifying elections, the Republican candidate that ended up being on the ballot came right out and said, if a Democrat ever won an election in the state of Arizona, I wouldn't certify it because I know that's fraudulent because Democrats don't get elected in the state of Arizona. That's what the man said. And not only did he say that, when he was given an opportunity, and I'm not saying he was confronted, I'm saying that the media in this town was sympathetic to this idiot and went back several times to give him an opportunity to recast, readjust, to flat out contradict what amounts to an asinine assertion. He had plenty of opportunities to go back and say, nah, that's not really what I meant, or I was taken out of context, even though he wasn't. This is what politicians do. This is what they say. They'll say they were taken out of context even when they weren't. This guy just doubled down on it. Emphatic. I said it. I mean it. If a Democrat gets elected office in this state, it's fraudulent because I don't know anyone that votes for Democrats. I'm not saying that that guy is not an existential threat to the very fabric of democracy. I do find it curious that any Democratic coalition, any political action committee, they would actually donate money to his campaign. But in fact, it happened. Over the course of the last month, you haven't heard that messaging from the Democratic Party. You're not hearing that from Kamala Harris or from Tim Walz. I'm not a pollster. I haven't done any real research into this, but it struck me that the messaging has changed. And why has it changed? First and foremost, Biden's base, which really doesn't exist. I mean, the interesting thing about Joe Biden is he's never really had a base. He's been a political chameleon. He can change his opinions, his fervor, whatever he's passionate about, to the whims of the Democratic Party at the time. He just happened to be the right guy in the right place with enough political capital to be the candidate to ward off Bernie Sanders. Again, Bernie Sanders being subverted by his own party. And so he was the guy to run against Trump. Over the course of the last 4 years, the only people who really are in what you'd call the Joe Biden camp are octogenarians, people 65 years or older. And people 65 years or older are easy to scare. They're easy to frighten. And what's an easy way to rally that population? There's an existential threat to fill in blank. There's an existential threat to your Social Security benefits, to your health care, to Golden Corral, to democracy itself. With that type of messaging from that particular candidate, Trump was on his way to winning the presidential election. Now that you have Kamala Harris coming in, and Tim Walz in particular, you're not hearing that type of messaging. And it was Tim Walz who introduced this new messaging that I believe the Democratic Party had tried to use back in 2016 and didn't know well enough how the world of memes worked in order to have it stick. The way to beat Donald Trump is to not legitimize him. And by calling him an existential threat, a threat to democracy, you're legitimizing him as a political candidate. The most effective way to counter Donald Trump has always been to make him out to be a clown, to lean into that reality star, that cartoon character, the failed businessman who was famous for being a businessman on a reality television show. I'm the last guy to know. I'm the last guy to get the memes. And even I have gotten some of these memes specific to J.D. Vance and Donald Trump that no doubt have to have their origins in left-leaning meme creators. And it's not all about how Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are an existential crisis to the very fabric of democracy. It's about how they're a bunch of weirdos. And they say weird things, and they do weird things, and they believe in weird things. Frankly, I find it effective. That is an effective way to discount Donald Trump. I don't care about your politics. This has nothing to do with your politics. This has everything to do with looking at how people strategize when it comes to the messaging about what they believe in, or to the contrary, what the other person believes in. And as we discussed in the last segment, Kamala Harris really isn't doing anything articulating to any degree any of the policies she says she supports. She's not defending any of them or allowing any of them to be challenged in any way in a one-to-one interview with a member of the media. What she is doing is she's messaging about the other side, the belief system of the other side, how that influences what they say and what they're going to do. Some of you may recall, I was the one who wanted there to be a documentary on how Trump, over the course of the last 10 years, became so orange. I'm not talking about some bare bones project. I'm not talking about some fan doc. I'm talking about a $5 to $10 million project investigating from the early aughts into roughly that 2014 period where he was using the Barack Obama birther claims to propel his likeness, his image into the public consciousness as part of his subtle run-up to announcing that he was going to run for president. I believe he was basically putting his finger in the water to gauge the temperature to see how many people would respond to that type of rhetoric, and many people did. And that was his barometer, if you will, as to whether or not he could take that type of rhetoric into the political sphere as a candidate and be successful. No one really knew how to deal with that bombast, in particular, the most liberal of the Democrats. They tried to counter with their own bombast, and they always looked like assholes. This new approach, simply calling it weird and pointing out with particularity how these things actually look in the light of day, particularly when you're memeing them, this is likely what the Democrats wanted to do way back in 2015 and 2016. They just didn't have the wherewithal to do it. I have heard this before. I'm not the one who's saying it or it's coming out of my mouth organically, that for a long time, the right really owned the left with the trolling memes, with all of these different accounts that were illuminating the wackiness, the stupidity, the craziness of the left. And I believe now that the left has caught up. Remember, it's always going to be an arms race. It's not just the NFL where it's a copycat league. It's everything else in life. And you saw the right jump out, and Trump's campaign in particular in 2016 really capitalize on social media in a different way. And now you've seen the left catch up. And it is not easy when you've got a candidate like Donald Trump to refute this type of messaging, this type of approach, because he says some wacky shit. And he is an orange man. Orange man says wacky shit is the fodder for a great documentary. That the orange man that says wacky shit just happened to be president of the United States, it's even better. Perhaps we won't get that documentary. What we will get and what we have seen is plenty o' memes. Orange man says wacky shit is truly the fodder for the meme-verse, the meme universe. And it appears J.D. Vance has been pulled into that orbit. I still think that the election's going to be a coin flip. I think there's a lot more that's going to occur over the course of the next 65, 70 days. I mean, it's crazy to think that less than 6 weeks ago, a presidential candidate got shot at and we barely even mention it anymore. But as I sit here today with this episode of the podcast, episode 34, in the second to last week of August before a November election, this new messaging of simply putting under a microscope the things that these political candidates are saying and creating memes from that, this is likely what the left was trying to accomplish in 2016, and they just didn't have anybody who knew what they were doing well enough to accomplish it. This isn't an echo chamber message. This is a broad appeal message. You know you're not appealing specifically to people who are 73 years old when the messaging is coming through more a meme and not through old man yelling at a rally being rebroadcast by a legacy media outlet. Take into consideration, dear listener, that a vice presidential candidate made a joke about another vice presidential candidate, the whole Tim Walsh sofa couch thing with regard to JD Vance. And that was based off of what? A meme that had circulated on social media not 72 hours before the comment was made. That's how different this campaign is now compared to what it was not 8 weeks ago. The Biden administration and the Democratic Party was hiring TikTok influencers to figure out how they could help their messaging. And the Kamala Harris and Tim Walz campaign is simply allowing the left-leaning memers to do the work for them. The strategy has been so effective that a vice presidential candidate could make a comment based on a meme and have it land not only inside an arena full of, 40,000 people, but land for a national audience. The left having caught up in the trolling memes, that does not bode well for Orange Man that says wacky shit. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.